Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise tonight in tribute to one of the greatest jurists in this nation's history, Justice Antonin Scalia. Had a preeminent mind, following an excellent education, had a beautiful family, has a beautiful family, and he has already been very sorely missed. I thought it might be helpful, Mr. Speaker, and get a sense of the man and how profoundly concerned he was with the place in which this country finds itself after world wars, after depression, after all kinds of threats, massive civil war in the 1860s, all kinds of things that have threatened this nation, even the War of 1812, during which this capital was set on fire. All these threats, and yet, at this time in which we live, he could see and he tried to sound the warning alarms for what a majority of the Supreme Court was doing to this country. So it seemed to be encapsulated rather well back in 2008, June 12, 2008 decision in the case of Boumediene versus George Bush, President of the United States, combined with another. The decision of the majority of the court, as Justice Scalia pointed out, was so totally inconsistent with the majority's own majority opinion in prior case regarding people who are captured on the battlefield, who are clearly at war with the United States, and throughout the history of warfare, well, at least among civilized nations during the period of warfare, or history of warfare, the civilized thing to do was to hold those who were at war with you until such time as the group they represent, they come from, declare they're no longer at war with you. Then they can be released unless they have committed some heinous crime for which they should account beyond that of being part of the war against the nation. So the Supreme Court majority had previously said basically that, of course, the Constitution gives the Congress the power to create tribunals, to create courts. As my former constitutional law professor said, you know, there's only one court in the whole country, in the whole country's federal system, that owes its creation to the U.S. Constitution, and that is the U.S. Supreme Court. All other federal courts, tribunals, owe their existence and their jurisdiction to the United States Congress. So the majority court had previously said, in effect, that Congress could, in cases where enemy combatants are seized on the battlefield, hold them without right of writ of habeas corpus, because that has basically been the history of civilized warfare. Obviously, in uncivilized warfare, people were taken, abused, tortured, made slaves. That's happened throughout the history of mankind. But for nations that were civilized, you simply held them, and hopefully in humanitarian conditions. Well, in the Boumediene case, Justice Scalia starts his dissent by saying, I shall devote most of what will be a lengthy opinion to the legal errors contained in the opinion of the court. Contrary to my usual practice, however, I think it appropriate to begin with a description of the disastrous consequences of what the court has done today. Justice Scalia goes on, America is at war with radical Islamists. The enemy began by killing Americans and American allies abroad. 241 at the Marine Barracks in Lebanon, 19 at the Khobar Towers in Tehran, 224 at our embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, 17 on the USS Cole in Yemen. On September 11, 2001, the enemy brought the battle to American soil, killing 2,749 at the Twin Towers in New York City, 184 at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and 40 in Pennsylvania. Threatened further attacks against our homeland. One need only walk about buttressed and barricaded Washington or board a plane anywhere in the country to know that the threat is a serious one. Our armed forces are now in the field against the enemy in Afghanistan and Iraq. Last week, 13 of our countrymen in arms were killed. The game of bait and switch that today's opinion plays upon the nation's commander-in-chief will make the war harder on us. What comes next is perhaps one of the most profound statements that any justice on the Supreme Court ever put in writing. But he was right, and being right in his discernment of the Supreme Court's decision, he knew he needed to put this next sentence in print. So Justice Scalia said this, talking about the majority opinion. He said, it will almost certainly cause more Americans to be killed. He said that consequence would be tolerable if necessary to preserve a time-honored legal principle vital to our constitutional republic. But it is this court's blatant abandonment of such a principle that produces the decision today. The president relied on our settled precedent in Johnson versus Eisentrager. This was back in 1950, when he established the prison in Guantanamo Bay for enemy aliens. Citing that case, the President's Office of Legal Counsel advised him that the great weight of legal authority indicates that a federal district court properly exercise habeas jurisdiction over an alien detained at Guantanamo Bay. Further down, the judge says, in short term, however, the decision is devastating. At least 30 of those prisoners hitherto released from Guantanamo Bay have returned to the battlefield. Others have succeeded in carrying on their atrocities against innocent civilians. In one case, a detainee released from Guantanamo Bay masterminded the kidnapping of 2 Chinese dam workers, one of whom was later shot to death when used as a human shield against Pakistani commandos. Another former detainee promptly resumed his post as a senior Taliban commander and murdered a United Nations engineer and 3 Afghan soldiers. Still another murdered an Afghan judge. It was reported only last month that a released detainee carried out a suicide bombing against Iraqi soldiers in Mosul, Iraq. Their return to the kill illustrates the incredible difficulty of assessing who is and who is not an enemy combatant in a foreign theater of operations where the environment does not lend itself to rigorous evidence collection. He goes on, Justice Scalia does, during the 1995 prosecution of Omar Abdul Rahman, federal prosecutors gave the names of 200 unindicted co-conspirators to the blind sheik's defense lawyers. That information was in the hands of Osama bin Laden within 2 weeks. Justice Scalia went on to write page after page explaining the perils that the overzealous and underthinking majority of the court had imposed on the United States, on our military, because Justice Scalia made clear when it comes to war, by the decision that the majority made to basically tell our military that instead of protecting yourself and protecting your brothers and sisters in arms, we are going to require you to go out there, gather up DNA evidence, get blood evidence, maybe just drive a forensic wagon out there onto the field of battle, start gathering evidence because some moronic person in a palace in Washington, palace being what some of the justices who first went through the new Supreme Court building said about it back in 1935, that palace in which they reside have said that in a time of war, we have lost our mind in America, and we're going to now start putting our military at risk of their very lives so they can go gather up evidence to satisfy some bloated judge in a palace in Washington. That's why he made the profound statement that he did in this dissent. His words, "It will almost certainly cause more Americans to be killed." That's extraordinary. But dear Justice Scalia finished the opinion, the dissenting opinion, by saying, "Today the court warps our Constitution in a way that goes beyond the narrow issue of the reach of the suspension clause, invoking judicially brainstormed separation of powers principles to establish a manipulable functional test for the extraterritorial reach of habeas corpus, and no doubt for the extraterritorial reach of other constitutional protections as well. It blatantly misdescribes important precedents, most conspicuously Justice Jackson's opinion for the court in Johnson versus Eisentrager. It breaks a chain of precedent as old as the common law that prohibits judicial inquiry into the detention of aliens abroad absent statutory authorization. And most tragically, it sets our military commanders the impossible task of proving to a civilian court, under whatever standards the court devises in the future, that evidence supports the confinement of each and every enemy prisoner. The nation will live to regret what the court has done today. I dissent." What a magnificent man. What a brilliant man with extraordinary common sense. So, Mr. Speaker, I had my staff help me. We've all been picking out favorite quotes that Justice Scalia has provided, both in written opinion and in speeches. One of Justice Scalia's statements was, "Never compromise your principles, unless, of course, your principles are Hitler's, in which case you would be well advised to compromise them as much as you can." Another statement by Justice Scalia, "More important than your obligation to follow your conscience, or at least prior to it, is your obligation to form your conscience correctly." Justice Scalia said, "You think there ought to be a right to abortion? No problem. The Constitution says nothing about it. Create it the way most rights are created in a democratic society. Pass a law. And that law, unlike a constitutional right to abortion created by a court, can compromise." He said, a constitution, been so much in the news, and our friends here on the floor have been raising questions about responsible, reasonable gun control. We want gun control that does not violate the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the purpose of which is to allow citizens to protect themselves. It's not just for hunting, but to allow citizens to protect themselves. And the thing that I noticed, Mr. Speaker, in my decade as a judge, the criminals that came before me for crimes used with a gun, they did not, I can't remember any of them. I think I handled around 6,000 cases, felony cases went through our court. I can't remember any where they went down to a gun store and bought a gun. They stole them. They bought them from other criminals. And with the 100 million guns that I understand have been purchased in recent years, it doesn't look like there will be any chance to remove guns from anyone except law-abiding citizens. But it's been interesting. You know, we inquired, my Republican friends, colleagues here, we inquired over and over, and still 7 years after President Obama took office, we know that shortly thereafter there was a scheme hatched within his administration to sell guns to criminals that would get to Mexico and fall in the hands of drug cartels. And they didn't adequately monitor. There were nothing put on the guns so they could be traced exactly where they were going. We know one of them was used to kill government agents. So whether it was intentional, reckless disregard for American government agent's life who was working for the president to have one of the president's subsidiaries or employees provide guns in such a way that they would end up killing one American agent and apparently hundreds of Mexicans. And we don't even know the full extent because we can't get answers from this administration. Eric Holder intentionally withheld evidence. He refused to provide information. I felt like he should have been impeached and thrown out of office. We never got answers about Fast and Furious. But we did see emails where within this administration, even after they got caught, that this administration had facilitated weapons being provided and sold to people who would take them to the drug cartels of Mexico. Even after they got caught, they were still wondering if it might be possible to use the fact that these guns were being used to create violence to justify attacks on Second Amendment and taking away Americans' gun rights. Apparently, November was a huge month for the sale of guns, and apparently Black Friday, the past week, has been a record for, not a record, but just a massive number of guns being sold. I believe I saw there were 185,000 requests for gun purchases Friday after Thanksgiving. Regardless of what the number was, if that's not completely accurate, it's staggering how many people are now in fear for themselves and their families because of the policies of this administration. Now, because of Fast and Furious and how there were people in the administration that were contemplating the sale of guns to drug cartels that this administration facilitated as a reason to have more gun control, it does make you question the motivation of some of the administration's policies. We know that especially the last 5 years of George W. Bush's presidency, his administration was vigorously prosecuting gun violations. But this administration has never prosecuted. In the 7 years, they've never prosecuted as vigorously as the Bush administration did in those times. And then we find out that not only were they not prosecuting as vigorously as they did in those 5 years, last 5 years of the Bush administration, but in recent years, they've been cutting back on the prosecution of gun violations. So we find out that in 2013, gun violation prosecutions by this administration diminished. And then we find out that in 2014, they diminished even further by this administration. And then we find out that in 2015, this administration set a record for the last 7 years of prosecuting fewer gun violation crimes than any administration. Well, this was the lowest this year, any of this last 7 years. So the administration, as they have increased the demand for more gun control to take guns away from law-abiding citizens, they have been decreasing the number of gun violations they've prosecuted. And in the wake of this administration's involvement in Fast and Furious and trying to use it to promote more gun control on law-abiding citizens, it makes you wonder, what is the reason this administration continues to prosecute fewer and fewer gun crimes? It's as if this administration, and I'm not saying, Mr. Parliamentarian, through the Speaker, I'm not saying a specific person or the President, I'm not violating the House rules, but I'm saying this administration in bulk, which doesn't violate the House rules, somehow has had this policy of prosecuting fewer and fewer gun crimes. At the same time, they're increasing rhetoric to have more gun control. It's as if, and I'm not alleging, I'm just saying it's as if they wanted gun violence to increase so that they could get more gun control, as it appears their motivation in using what happened with gun violence as a result of their 2,000 weapons they forced gun dealers to sell to people they shouldn't have. Well, when I first heard the proposal, gee, nobody who's on the no-fly list, can't even fly on a plane, should be able to go buy a gun. It seemed reasonable. I was talking to my friend Tom Price from Georgia back here earlier, Mr. Speaker. He said the same thing. It struck it, wow, that seems reasonable. Until you start considering how one gets on the no-fly list, who's been on the no-fly list, the massive abuses of individual constitutional rights by this administration, the abuses that of the IRS of law-abiding citizens that Richard Nixon could have only dreamed of abusing the way this administration has. But the trouble is, there's no due process for someone to be adjudicated to put on the no-fly list. There's no due process to get off the no-fly list. And in fact, one of the men I respect as much as anybody I know, he's a constituent, he's an Army veteran, he's a retired general, lives in East Texas. We've had to help him a number of times, once again, to get off the no-fly list. And unfortunately, we never can find out why he's ever put on the no-fly list in the first place. The only thing I know, he is a devout Christian. He is a supporter of mine. he would never knowingly violate the law of the United States. So I don't know. Is it because he's a supporter of mine? I mean, a year ago, I was trying to fly back from London, and an official there in the London airport with their security said, "Sir, I understand who you are. Very sorry, but your Homeland Security says you're somebody that has to be personally, physically searched along with everything that you have." Gee, maybe the way I cross-examined them in the judiciary hearing. Well, when you know that this administration has abused its power repeatedly, and you find out that actually the no-fly list is so obscure, it's like something from a Kafka novel. Never really enjoyed his novels. But the trial, it makes you think of, wow, you mean this obscure government entity can charge you with something, but you can't, just like in the trial, you can't find out what you're charged with. You can't find out why you're on the no-fly list. You can't find out if it's part of an enemy's list. You can't find out what's the best way to convince the government to get you off. Are there mistakes made? Well, gee, Mr. Speaker, could it be that a mistake was made when one of my constituent families from Lufkin was going to take their dream vacation to Disney World? They felt like the kids were old enough to enjoy it now. And when they tried to check their bags, they couldn't because of their 5 children. Their middle child was on the no-fly list. He was a potential terrorist. Now, I come from family with 4 kids, and if I was going to pick one of my siblings, including me, to be a terrorist, I would say it's probably the young one. Well, this child was 5 years old. He was the middle child, not the youngest. And they pulled him aside thinking his name's on the no-fly list. He must be a terrorist. Well, thankfully, in Houston, they had some common sense and quickly figured out this is not a terrorist. It's not. Not so when they tried to leave Orlando to fly back home. He was pulled aside. The 5-year-old, he was separated from his parents. His parents were fit to be tied. They were threatened. They were not allowed to be with their child. They take him off to interrogate him. A 5-year-old child. But he's on the no-fly list. And they couldn't figure this out. They think he's a terrorist. They ask him his date of birth. He's freaking out. He's separated from his parents and his other siblings. He knows the month and day. He can't tell them the year. So now they think he's withholding information. They endured a lot of counseling and nightmares because of the abuses of this administration's policies. And yes, mistakes are made like that. And sometimes when people's name get put on the no-fly list, you don't know what it's for. Here's an article, and I sure don't read from these folks very often, but the Los Angeles Times says it seems simple enough if the federal government, based on intelligence or policing, puts a person on his watch list of suspected terrorists or decrees, he or she is too dangerous to be allowed on an airplane. Then surely it would be foolish. Let that person buy a firearm in the United States. Makes sense, doesn't it? That was the thrust of a proposed law by Senator Dianne Feinstein. Goes on down. One problem is that the people on the no-fly list, as well as the broader terror watch list from which it is drawn, have not been convicted of doing anything wrong. They are merely suspected of having terror connections. I thought it was outrageous that Senator Ted Kennedy was on the no-fly list. I don't know. Maybe Homeland Security knew something the rest of America didn't know, but it seems silly. Senator Ted Stevens, the late senator's wife, Catherine Stevens, her name was on the no-fly list. She had those problems. So it could be that you're guilty of only having a name similar to somebody that was put on the list for who knows why, But that is not a good way to take people's guns away, to say, yes, we want to pass a law so that this administration, behind closed doors with the lowest learning